What is medical device cybersecurity? How is it different from medical device risk analysis? How do I comply with FDA cybersecurity regulations? And why did FDA say recently that everyone, and I quote, everyone, is doing medical device cybersecurity badly? We'll answer these questions and more on today's episode of MedTech Crossroads. It's been said, wherever you go, there you are. And while philosophical observations like this seem of little value in the world of medical devices, in fact, this is really the whole game. Whether the question is safety, efficacy, or cybersecurity, it turns out that your life gets a whole lot easier or a whole lot harder depending on what you bring to the table. Take this rock, for instance. No cybersecurity concerns here. But if this rock were a medical device, the minute I give it any possibility of connecting to the internet, as attractive as that capability may sound to your clinicians and investors, you've now opened the door to cybersecurity concerns. And since there's no near-term plan to put the genie back in the bottle and return anytime soon to the Stone Age, cybersecurity is here to stay. If you have a cyber device as defined by FDA, you have to deal with FDA medical device cybersecurity regulations and guidance. Before we talk about what a cyber device is or why FDA says everyone is doing cyber badly, a little bit of history is in order. On December 29, 2022, the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, or FDORA, was signed into law. This added a new section, Section 524B, entitled Ensuring Cybersecurity of Devices, to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that governs medical devices in the U.S. So what is a cyber device according to FDA? Section 524B, Subpart C, defines a cyber device as having all three of the following characteristics. It includes software, validated, installed, or authorized by the sponsor, as a device or in a device. It has the ability to connect to the internet, and it contains any such technological characteristics validated, installed, or authorized by the sponsor that could be vulnerable to cyber threats. As you're going to see, number 3 is kind of a throwaway. Interpreted broadly, all software that can connect to the internet can in some way, shape, or form be considered vulnerable to cybersecurity threats, especially when you hear about FDA's new regulatory pillar. Breaking news. It's no longer just safety and efficacy, but more on that later. So there are really only two meaningful characteristics here to what makes a cyber device. Does your device have software? And can the device possibly connect to the internet? I emphasize possibly because FDA isn't asking, do you intend your device to connect to the internet? Or do you think anyone wants to connect your device to the internet? The question is, could it? Could it connect to the internet? And this includes intentional hacking of the device, whether or not you think it's likely or even attractive to a hacker. We'll say more about that in a minute. So bottom line, if your medical device contains software, and that includes firmware, and has either an external physical port where the microprocessor can be accessed, or a wireless connection to the microprocessor like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, LoRa, you're going to need to address cybersecurity concerns. I'll be honest, when cybersecurity first came across our radar and into being a few years ago, my initial impression was to want to justify why many devices are not cyber devices. And further, I wondered, isn't this just yet another part of medical device risk analysis? I mean, if a user or patient can't be harmed directly, or if it would just be too hard to hack or a hacker wouldn't have any clear motivation, we're good, right? Right? Turns out my initial impression was way off base. At the MedCon conference in 2023, Matt Hazlitt from FDA presented a great session on FDA's current thinking on cybersecurity. Matt made statements like the following, quote, FDA has found some 510K submissions not substantially equivalent, and some pre-market approval devices not approvable, based solely on cybersecurity concerns. Matt even went so far as to say that medical device developers can't consider the probability that a hacker would have motivation to breach a cyber device. Rather, he said we have to assume that they would want to. Further, he said that patient risk was not necessarily in view. This isn't simply risk analysis for safety and efficacy. This is something new. Cyber penetrability, independent of patient risk, now matters. And as if that weren't enough, Matt went on further in his really good presentation to say that, quote, no one is doing cybersecurity well. I'll go into more detail on this near the end of this presentation and describe what Matt called the Google test, a somewhat controversial approach FDA is encouraging its reviewers to use. After the presentation, I could hardly believe it. It seemed like FDA was saying that the two legs of the regulatory world, historically safety and efficacy, were now being joined by a third leg, cybersecurity. A few months later, I had opportunity at an FDA-hosted event to sidebar with Jeff Shuren in what was one of his last public appearances as the head of CDRH. I asked him directly, Jeff, is this FDA's intention? Do you want us to think now in terms of safety, efficacy, and cybersecurity? He answered in the affirmative. The new regulatory standard is still safety and efficacy, and these concern the patient and the user. But now cyber devices must include a reasonable assurance of cyber impenetrability, whether or not it can harm the patient, and whether or not it seems attractive to a hacker. We'll talk in a minute about why, according to FDA, no one is doing cybersecurity well. But before that, let's review some basics about how to comply with FDA's cybersecurity expectations. At a high level, according to Section 524B, manufacturers must submit, number one, a cybersecurity management plan, including coordinated vulnerability disclosure procedures. Two, documentation providing reasonable assurance that the device and related systems are secure with regular updates and patches. And three, a software bill of materials. But the expectations go beyond that and are currently outlined in at least 8 FDA guidance documents. That's more than we can cover in this discussion, but we'll put those links in the description. Keep in mind that there is overlap between FDA cybersecurity deliverables and parts of your IEC 62304 software lifecycle processes. Further, the ISO 60601 family of standards points to IEC 62304, and so if your 21 CFR or ISO 13485 design control process calls for 60601, which calls for a 62304, and those should somehow integrate FDA cyber concerns, you can see how nested and interrelated this stack of standards becomes. Long story short, please don't try to manage cybersecurity completely independently of everything else. It's not going to work. You need an integrated development approach, starting with your top-level design controls, integrating appropriate standards and substandards, and making room for country-specific requirements, like FDA's current cybersecurity expectations under 524B. If you need help sorting through all these interrelated layers of your development strategy, please feel free to reach out to IntuBeing, and be sure to check out our other videos. We'd be remiss if we didn't say a word about threat modeling. Threat modeling isn't FDA's invention. It's been around for a while. FDA has actually recognized a number of industry threat models as acceptable ways to approach medical device cybersecurity. For those unfamiliar with threat modeling, some of the tables would look vaguely familiar to those who understand techniques like failure mode and effects analysis. They're just very specific to expected cyber needs. So why these big changes? And why does FDA say no one is doing cybersecurity well? My hypothesis, and this is supported by statements made in Matt's talk, as well as elsewhere, is that FDA has recognized that hospitals and healthcare settings are not cybersecure environments. They're just not. And with increasing ransomware attacks against large entities, every vulnerable device becomes another vector for penetration. And there is motivation for hackers to take down large hospital systems. They're not necessarily trying to hurt your grandma, but if grandma's device is a vector, they're going to use it. When you think about it that way, perhaps these new expectations aren't as controversial as they first sounded to me. A decade or more ago, when the industry was wrestling with how to use commercial data transfer systems that weren't cleared as medical devices, It quickly became incumbent upon devices themselves to validate data traveling through the wild west of the telecom infrastructure. You actually can't trust the environment you're in. So cybersecurity becomes everyone's business. Now, what's this about no one doing it well? And the Google test. Apparently, FDA is recommending the Google test to its reviewers. Reviewers are actually being encouraged to Google it. So if you say that you're using a certain technique to mitigate cyber risk, and an FDA reviewer Googles it and comes up with anything negative to say, it doesn't mean that they're domain experts versed in the nuance that your dev team hopefully is. So buckle up. They're likely not to think much of your approach because you can find anything on Google, whether it applies or not. Medical device companies need to be prepared to educate FDA on why the mitigations chosen are appropriate and robust. But this certainly lends to an impression on FDA's part that no one is doing it well. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of MedTech Crossroads. As always, we want time spent with MedTech Crossroads to help you on your medical device development journey. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you need help crafting your medical device development strategy and then executing it.